The Dust Bowl was one of the greatest ecological and human disasters in American history, a perfect storm of environmental mismanagement and climatic extremes that devastated the heartland of the United States during the 1930s. It was a phenomenon born out of a combination of human ambition, economic pressures, and natural forces, unfolding over a decade and affecting millions of lives. It transformed the way people thought about the land, about farming, and about the very notion of American prosperity that had once seemed so limitless. Across the endless plains dot at the beginning of the 20th century, the Great Plains were seen as an opportunity, a vast expanse of rich land that seemed to promise wealth and security for those willing to work it. After the Homestead Act of 1862, waves of settlers moved westward, encouraged by the government to claim and cultivate these lands. Over time, advancements in agricultural technology, such as mechanized plows and tractors, made it easier to break the dense native prairie grasses and plant cash crops, especially wheat. World War I further accelerated this trend as demand for American wheat soared globally, leading to high prices and incentives to plant as much as possible. Farmers tore up millions of acres of natural prairie, a landscape that had for thousands of years been shaped and stabilized by grasses whose deep roots held the soil in place against the fierce winds that often swept across the plains. These grasses, evolved to survive in a harsh climate of drought and deluge, were essential to the ecosystem's stability. When they were removed, the land's resilience was destroyed, without farmers fully realizing it. At first, it seemed like a triumph of human ingenuity and industry. Wheat prices remained high, machinery improved, and entire towns sprang up across what had once been considered an inhospitable frontier. However, by the late 1920s, problems were beginning to appear. Wheat prices dropped sharply after the war, leading to overproduction as farmers tried to make up for lower profits by planting even more acres. The soil was becoming exhausted, stripped of nutrients by continuous monoculture farming without any understanding of soil conservation techniques. Fields that had once produced healthy yields began to fail, but instead of fallowing the land or rotating crops, farmers continued to plow and plant, driven by economic necessity and a lack of ecological knowledge. In 1931, drought gripped the plains. It was the beginning of a dry period that would last almost a decade. Rainfall, which was always variable in the region, dropped to record lows. Crops shriveled and died in the fields. Without plant cover, the topsoil, now loose and dry, was vulnerable to the strong winds that had always been a feature of the area. Dust storms began to form, at first small and local, then larger and more devastating. The winds lifted the fine particles of dry soil into the air, creating massive walls of dust that could travel hundreds of miles. By 1932, there were over 14 major dust storms recorded, and the number only grew in subsequent years. Some storms were so vast and powerful that they blocked out the sun for days, turning noon into night. Visibility could drop to a few feet. Dust would infiltrate every crack and crevice, covering food, filling lungs, killing livestock, and making life almost unbearable. People used wet cloths to cover their faces, stuffed rags under doors and windows, and still, the dust found its way inside. Schools were closed, cars were abandoned on roads because engines clogged with dirt, and entire towns were half buried in drifting dust. The worst day came on April 14, 1935, a date that became known as Black Sunday. A monstrous dust storm, perhaps the worst of all, swept across the plains, plunging cities and farms into total darkness. Witnesses described it as an apocalyptic event, a rolling black wall of dirt that consumed everything in its path. Black Sunday became a symbol of the Dust Bowl's fury and a turning point in the national consciousness. Newspaper photos and stories brought the catastrophe into homes across America, and the plight of the plains farmers could no longer be ignored. The human toll was immense. Health problems like dust pneumonia became common, particularly among children and the elderly. Families lost their farms to foreclosure as crops failed year after year. Unable to repay debts accumulated during better times, banks repossessed land, and government aid was often slow or insufficient. Thousands of families were displaced, becoming migrants in search of work, shelter, and food. Many headed west to California, lured by rumors of plentiful jobs in agriculture and industry. These migrants, often labeled derisively as Okies regardless of their state of origin, found hardship rather than opportunity waiting for them. Camps, of destitute families sprang up on the edges of cities and farms, and competition for scarce jobs fueled resentment and discrimination. The Dust Bowl was not just a crisis of nature. It was also a social and economic collapse. The communities that had been built on dreams of prosperity now faced disintegration. Churches, schools, and local businesses struggled to survive. Some people held on stubbornly, refusing to leave the land they had fought to claim, while others saw no choice but to pack what little they could carry and move on, often leaving behind generations of family history buried under the dust. The federal government eventually responded to the growing disaster. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal included programs aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. The Soil Conservation Service was created in 1935 to teach farmers sustainable farming practices, like contour plowing, crop rotation, and planting windbreaks of trees to slow the wind. The government also bought up failing farms and attempted to resettle destitute farmers. Efforts were made to replant native grasses on the most damaged lands, slowly. These measures began to mitigate the worst effects of the Dust Bowl, but it would take years before the land and its people recovered. The ecological lessons of the Dust Bowl were profound. It demonstrated the dangers of ignoring the natural limitations of the environment in pursuit of economic gain. It revealed the need for scientific agriculture and government oversight to protect common resources. It also showed the resilience and stubbornness of the American people, who, even in the face of near-biblical disasters, found ways to endure and rebuild. Yet the psychological scars remained. For many who lived through it, the Dust Bowl left a lingering fear of drought and economic collapse, shaping attitudes and policies for decades to come. It became a cautionary tale taught to future generations, a reminder that the land cannot be endlessly exploited without consequence. The photographs of dust storms engulfing towns, of children wearing makeshift dust masks, of abandoned farms half buried in dunes of dirt, became enduring images of American hardship and perseverance. Even today, the Dust Bowl holds relevance, as climate change threatens to bring more extreme weather events, longer droughts, and soil degradation. The Dust Bowl serves as a historical warning of what can happen when human actions and natural forces collide destructively. Modern soil conservation efforts, sustainable farming techniques, and environmental protections all trace some lineage back to the hard lessons learned. During that grim decade, the Dust Bowl did not occur in isolation. It was part of a larger tapestry of economic and environmental disaster during the Great Depression. Together, they revealed the fragility of modern society when faced with the forces of nature and the limits of growth. While technological optimism had dominated the early 20th century, the Dust Bowl shattered the belief that human progress was inevitable, or that nature could always be controlled. Millions of acres of farmland were abandoned or rendered useless. Some areas never fully recovered agriculturally. Others were painstakingly rehabilitated through federal programs, conservation efforts, and sheer human tenacity. The migrants who left the plains brought with them their culture, their labor, and their experience, reshaping the social and economic fabric of places like California's Central Valley. The Dust Bowl was not merely a story of environmental catastrophe. It was a human story, one of suffering, migration, resilience, and ultimately adaptation. It showed that while human beings can cause great harm to the environment through ignorance or greed, they can also learn, change, and strive to live in greater harmony with the natural world. The black blizzards of the 1930s are long gone, but their legacy remains, written in the history of the land and in the collective memory of a nation that lived through the choking dust and survived. The origins of the Dust Bowl can be traced back even earlier than the 1930s, when settlers first moved into the Great Plains. Prior to their arrival, the land was dominated by vast, resilient ecosystems that included millions of acres of tall grasses, bison herds, and complex weather patterns that were challenging but sustainable for native plants and animals. Indigenous peoples had lived with the land, not against it, using techniques that preserved the soil and respected its limitations. However, with the expansion of the railroads, new farming technologies, and government policies encouraging settlement, the delicate balance was disrupted. The grasses that had held the soil together through countless cycles of drought and rain were ripped away in favor of fields of wheat and other cash crops that lacked the same protective qualities. The economic incentives for intensive farming were massive. During the early 20th century, wheat prices soared, especially during World War I. When the United States became a major food supplier to Europe, the slogan "Wheat will win the war" encouraged farmers to plow even marginal lands that were previously thought unsuitable for farming. Technological advances like the steel plow and mechanized tractor made it possible to cultivate land at a scale and speed never before imagined. Farmers took out loans to buy more land and equipment, confident that high wheat prices would continue indefinitely. There was little understanding of the long-term impact this would have on the soil or the environment. The prevailing wisdom of the time assumed that rain would follow the plow, a belief that human settlement and farming would somehow cause permanent changes in weather patterns, making the arid plains more hospitable. This belief turned out to be tragically wrong. As the 1920s progressed, cracks in this optimistic vision began to appear. After the war, wheat prices fell dramatically as European agriculture recovered, leading to a glut in the market. Farmers, burdened by debt, responded by planting even more wheat, hoping to offset low prices with higher yields. This vicious cycle only exacerbated the problem, leaving the soil increasingly exposed and depleted. At the same time, climate conditions began to shift. A natural cycle of drought that had occurred periodically for centuries in the plains returned. With a vengeance, the 1930s ushered in some of the hottest, driest years on record, creating a tinderbox of environmental vulnerability. By 1931, the drought had fully taken hold. Crops failed across the plains, and farmers who had once dreamed of prosperity found themselves unable to harvest anything at all. Without the protective cover of crops or grasses, the soil, now dry and loose, became prey to the relentless winds that swept across the flat landscape. Dust storms, at first infrequent and localized, grew in size and frequency until they became a defining feature of life on the plains. Entire farms, once the pride of hard-working families, were swallowed by dust. Houses, barns, and machinery were buried under layers of fine silt. Fences disappeared under drifts of dirt. Even the air itself became a hazard, filled with particles that made breathing difficult and hazardous to health. The physical effects of the Dust Bowl were horrifying. Dust pneumonia, a condition caused by inhaling fine dust particles, became a common affliction, especially among children and the elderly. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and many people died from respiratory complications. Everyday life became a battle against the encroaching dust. People nailed wet sheets over windows and doors, wore improvised masks when venturing outside, and struggled to keep their homes livable. Cooking and eating were difficult when dust settled into every corner. Clothes had to be washed constantly, only to be covered in dust again the moment they were hung to dry. Water, already scarce due to the drought, became even more precious as dust contaminated wells and cisterns. Economic devastation compounded the physical suffering. With no crops to sell, farmers could not repay loans or buy supplies. Banks were closed on farms, displacing families who had worked the land for decades. Land values plummeted, wiping out the wealth and security that had once been tied to property ownership. Towns shrank as businesses closed, schools lost students, and churches saw dwindling congregations. In many communities, the social fabric itself began to unravel as people lost hope and abandoned their homes in search of a better life elsewhere. Migration became the only option for many. Tens of thousands of families, often with little more than what they could fit into battered cars or makeshift trailers, took to the roads. Most headed west to California. Lured by the promise of jobs in agriculture and industry, the journey was perilous, with vehicles breaking down, sickness spreading in crowded migrant camps, and exploitation awaiting those who managed to reach their destination. Life in California was often no better than what they had left behind. Migrant laborers faced discrimination, poverty, and brutal working conditions in the fields and orchards. They lived in squalid camps, struggling to maintain their dignity and provide for their families. Meanwhile, the federal government was beginning to recognize the scale of the disaster and the need for intervention. Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration launched a series of New Deal programs aimed at providing relief to struggling farmers, restoring the land, and reforming agricultural practices to prevent future catastrophes. The Soil Conservation Service, established in 1935, played a pivotal role in educating farmers about sustainable practices such as contour plowing, strip cropping, and planting cover crops to protect the soil. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men to plant trees, build windbreaks, and restore damaged ecosystems. In addition to immediate relief efforts, The government promoted long-term changes in land use and farming techniques. The concept of land stewardship began to replace the older ideology of conquest and exploitation. Scientists and policymakers realized that farming practices needed to be adapted to the realities of the Great Plains environment, not imposed upon it blindly. Large-scale projects aimed at replanting native grasses, rotating crops, and managing grazing practices were launched. Gradually, these efforts began to yield results, and by the end of the decade, some parts of the plains were beginning to recover. However, the psychological and cultural impact of the Dust Bowl would linger for generations. Those who lived through it carried the memories of hardship, loss, and migration with them for the rest of their lives. Many who left the plains never returned, permanently altering the demographics of the region. Others stayed, rebuilding their communities and adopting new ways of living with the land. The Dust Bowl entered the American consciousness as a symbol of both human folly and resilience, a stark reminder of the limits of nature and the importance of respecting environmental boundaries. The Dust Bowl also left a legacy in literature, art, and music. Writers like John Steinbeck captured the plight of migrant families in novels, such as The Grapes of Wrath, while photographers like Dorothea Lange documented the faces of suffering and perseverance during this era. These cultural artifacts helped to humanize the statistics and convey the emotional depth of the disaster to future generations. They ensured that the story of the Dust Bowl would not be forgotten, that it would serve as a cautionary tale for those who might otherwise repeat the mistakes of the past. Scientific understanding of soil erosion, climate cycles, and sustainable agriculture advanced dramatically because of the Dust Bowl. Researchers began to study the long-term patterns of drought and rainfall in the plains, leading to better forecasting and planning. Techniques developed during this period laid the groundwork for modern conservation farming methods, which aim to balance agricultural productivity with environmental stewardship. As the 1940s dawned, the end of the Dust Bowl era became visible. A return of more regular rainfall patterns helped revive farming, and an economic boom triggered by World War II provided new opportunities for displaced families and communities. Yet the scars remained etched into the landscape and the collective memory. Some areas that had been most severely damaged by erosion were never fully restored, and remain reminders of the disaster even today. In the broader sweep of history, the Dust Bowl stands as an example of how human ambition, technological innovation, and environmental ignorance can combine to create unforeseen and devastating consequences. It also offers hope, illustrating that through learning, adaptation, and collective action, recovery is possible. It challenges every generation to consider the costs of unchecked development and to find a more sustainable path forward. The Dust Bowl was a tragedy, but it was also a crucible from which new ideas and new commitments to land stewardship emerged. It reshaped the American heartland not only in its physical contours, but in its people's relationship to the earth beneath their feet. It was a sobering lesson in humility, a reminder that no matter how powerful human technology and ambition may be, nature ultimately sets the terms of life on this planet. The story of the Dust Bowl remains a powerful reminder of how deeply human actions are intertwined with the environment. It teaches that resilience is born from hardship, that survival demands both respect for nature and the courage to change, even today. Its lessons echo across the world, urging new generations to tread more carefully upon the land. If this journey through history gave you insight or inspiration, feel free to share it.